So would you please make very, very welcome, all the way from Washington, D.C. in the United States. She's over her jet lag now, so it should be fine. Please make very, very welcome Dr. Jenny E. Gerbi.
Thank you. Hello. You've had what looks like has been an amazing 2 weeks. I have to say that I'm pretty envious looking at all of the things that you've been able to do and hear about. And I think about back when I was in high school, and it was a pretty different situation than that. I want to thank the ISS and University of Sydney for bringing me here. It was very generous of them to do so. I think this is an amazing, amazing program, and especially Christopher, just thank you so much. They've been amazing in terms of being able to get me here and be able to do what I wanted to do. So we have 2 chances to chat, one today and one tomorrow. And I was thinking about the order in which I wanted to do things. And today what I'm going to do is talk quite a bit about sort of my career, back to when I was in high school, just to sort of give you some context and frame it for questions that you might want to ask tomorrow. Then I'm going to go into a little bit of research that I did in grad school and whether or not things actually mattered, which is an interesting question to think about. And then tomorrow I'll talk a little bit more about actually ARPA-E and a program that I put together there, and we'll have plenty of time for questions tomorrow. So this is the question that we ask when people were thinking of coming to ARPA-E is, would you like $30 million to change the world? That's the general size of the programs that we put on there. So the answer to this is yes, always. That's not really the question. The question is, how would you spend $30 million to change the world? And really think about that. There are people that just break their backs working really, really hard on research problems, and maybe they don't get to see the benefits for 60 to 100 years, so they're never going to see the benefits. Some people work in very applied areas. Doing something that's impactful does not mean that you're going to do something that will deliver a product in 3 years, but it means you understand where you're going and what it needs to look like when you get there, what that solution is. So keep this in the back of your mind. I'd be very interested to hear what some of you think about this after the talks that you've seen over the past 2 weeks. And this really is sort of how we frame things when we're thinking about problems we want to solve at ARPA-E. So energy is amazing. We know energy is amazing. Sometimes we forget it. Sometimes it gets a bad rap. But think back to before we had distributed power and electricity and what things were like. There were probably a few things that were better, and most things were worse. And this touches every aspect of our lives. And we can't really divorce our lives from these technical problems in energy, because at the end of the day, it's because we're humans. It's because we need to be heated and cooled, and we need to see things, and we need to check our cat videos on Facebook. These are very important things, and it's because we're human. So we always have to think about the context of the problem that we're trying to solve. We might develop an amazing technology, but if it requires a human to do something, it might not end up having an impact. Energy is everywhere. So I was so excited that the person who spoke before me was here, because I was thinking about a chain of talking about when we use energy, and this is one of my favorite YouTube channels. This is a guy who goes to North Queensland, and he does primitive technology just with his bare hands. He'll make a forge. He makes little houses. It's amazing what he does. There's no talking. So he's there doing nothing with energy, using his body. But there's a camera recording him. There are optics, integrated circuits, semiconductors, electrochemical storage. He brings that back to his house and uses the internet so that I can see it in Washington, D.C. a few minutes later, after it goes through the cloud, which means it goes through a bunch of server farms, which all use energy and need to be cooled. And then I get that back on my integrated circuits and semiconductors and displays, and I get to watch a video of him not using energy. So you think how much energy it took for me to watch that video of him not using energy. And this is one of my favorite things ever. If you have not watched this channel, you have got to check it out. It is very cool. But energy is also a problem, and there's a lot of reasons why it's a problem, and you've probably heard a lot of them over the past couple weeks. One of the ones that I think is really terrifying, honestly, is really the cooling challenge, which is that as countries become more developed, they generally start to add air conditioning. So heating is pretty old technology, but there's a lot of countries that don't have air conditioning yet that dearly want it. And as somebody who spent a lot of quality time in Virginia in the summer without air conditioning when I was a graduate student. Air conditioning is awesome. The problem is air conditioning obviously takes a lot of energy, and depending on refrigerants used, depending on the efficiency of the units, it can make a very big impact in terms of the amount of energy, the amount of carbon in the atmosphere that is going to occur. And looking at predictions of this is actually really hard. One of the best ways to look at it is actually the number of units predicted to be sold. And when you look at this over the next 20 years and you see that that's going to triple or more, that really starts to get scary. So we think about, well, what are ways that we can use technology to help countries that are adopting air conditioning now leapfrog the current technology and use something that's much better? So there's problems like this that are really significant that sometimes in our everyday life we don't really think about, but we have to think about these things on a global scale. So that's an example of where energy is actually a huge problem, because I certainly don't want to give up my air conditioning, and right now in Washington, D.C., it is, all right, 95 Fahrenheit, what is that, 30-something, and very humid. So fixing this will be interesting. Thanks in advance to all of you, because you're all going to fix this. But there's a lot of different ways that you can fix this. And so there's a lot of things to think about in terms of your own careers, in terms of which field of science you want to go into and how you're going to solve these problems. There's a lot of different ways you can do this. So I'm going to talk a little bit about who I am, just so you have some context in which to ask questions for this. And now I have a quick question to ask of you. So I went to a high school that had 50 people in my graduating class, and half of them actually went to a technical school, so it was more like 25 kids in my graduating class. Is there anybody here from a school that was that small? Excellent. All right, you automatically just made me feel better. Are there any people here from a high school where your graduating class had 1,000 people in it? Yeah, okay. So that's quite a range. So the opportunities are going to be very different in schools like that, not necessarily one better than the other, but you're already starting off from very different backgrounds if you're starting off from schools that are that different. So I come from the point of view from a pretty rural area that was a couple hours north of New York City, in a very, very small town with a very small school. So we didn't have a lot of AP classes, for example. We couldn't take band if we also wanted to take chorus. Like, the classes were pretty limited. So this is sort of my educational background here. So I had that small high school. I then got a scholarship, since I was the valedictorian, which is not that hard to do when there's only 25 kids in your class. But I got a special scholarship to go to Bard College, which is a small liberal arts college in New York that had these scholarships for people that went to small high schools. So that was very nice. So I also did work study and had loans, but that helped a lot. It was an expensive school. It was interesting school because it's different than what a lot of other people do in terms of going to a big state school. So I took, literature and history and, dance and art and all of these different things, along with physics and almost all of the chemistry classes. That was a lot of classes to take, but that actually really benefited me. And one of the reasons it benefited me is I had so many credits that instead of my last semester being at Bard College, I got to go to Argonne National Lab on this special sort of semester program. And I could only do that because I took so many extra classes. And that was an amazing opportunity. I also did a summer, something called a Research Experience for Undergraduates, an RAU program. And I did that at College of William and Mary in Virginia. That's when we didn't have air conditioning. And worked on making wire chambers for these high-energy physics experiments. So I had a lot of sort of opportunities that were outside of my tiny little college. And it was really important I did that because those helped me get into grad school. So then I went to University of Virginia, and I got a master's in physics, and I have some stories to tell you about Virginia. And, okay, that's one of the stories I'll tell you right now. So it was really rough, actually. It was, there was a lot of competition. I have some friends there, but I wouldn't call a lot of the professors understanding. When I went to Bard, I only had one semester of a lot of classes that most people had 2 semesters of. I had only 1 semester of quantum, 1 semester mechanics, so I was already starting off behind everybody else. And I'm not one of those people for whom physics is super easy. It was easy in high school, but it was not easy in college, so I had to work really hard. So that was already hard. And then my apartment got robbed. That was another thing. And then the physics building sort of burned down, so that was a problem. We had all our offices in there, all of our books and notes, because we taught classes. That's how you get your stipend. So that was very exciting. And that was, you know, there were a lot of signs that maybe it was time to move on. So never be afraid to change. It's good learning from that. So I ended up getting a master's. Oh, hold on. Oh, let's bring the fire back. So I actually got to go to Fermilab, which was back in Illinois, and this was super fun. So I got to work on learning AutoCAD and designing wire chambers for some more high-energy physics experiments. So it was a little bit similar to some of the other stuff I did. And it was really cool. I mean, you don't often get to see stuff like this. And to actually, you go and you live in these little houses that are all painted primary colors. So you're living in a house with your advisor, which is already creepy. And then, you know, you bike over to the big Fermilab building and you go down and you see these giant, you know, huge vacuum pumps and wire chambers and things like that. And up on top where the ring is, there's buffalo inside of it. So you can say hi to the buffalo. It's all very exciting. So that was really fun, and I'm really glad that I didn't give up. It was a pretty rough experience, but I got a master's, I got to do that project, and I got out. And I went to the University of Illinois. The University of Illinois was much, much better. It was better suited for me. Material science really brings physics and chemistry together. So I did electronic materials there, so I mean, that's a good major to be in. And so I don't think that I would have continued in physics if I hadn't sort of made that change. So physics actually served me very well in material science. And then there was some tricky stuff there too. So in 2000, my mother died, and what I did is I had spent a number of months actually going to help take care of her for 2 weeks, then going back and doing 2 weeks of research, and then going back and working on the data when I helped with my mom and going back. And I did that for months. So my advisor was amazing that he let me do that. And that was incredibly important to me, because I'm not sure what would have happened if he wouldn't have let me do that. So there's an example of somebody who was very, very helpful in making sure I could continue my career. So I had wanted to go to grad school for 4 years. I ended up taking 5 because of that. But I did graduate, and it was really, Illinois was a great experience. The most important thing at Illinois was the buddies that I studied with for various classes and for the qualifying exams. And your qualifying exam study partners are probably some of the most important people you'll ever meet. So that's something I'll talk about. Then I went to Argonne National Lab and grew diamond films, and that was all very exciting. And there was a startup that came out of that group. And I'll talk about that a little bit more later if I can. So that was interesting to learn how a national lab works and how startups work and that. And then I did another postdoc and had a baby. So that's sort of how that all works. And then I went into the workforce. So again, this is just to give you some context on what my background is like. If you want to ask about any of this sort of stuff tomorrow, ask about any of it. So then in terms of what I did is I ended up going to Dow Chemical, which was totally bizarre, not something I would have done with a background in solar. I'm not a chemical engineer, but they were starting a new business to make solar shingles. And this was supposed to revolutionize solar. It would be as easy to install as a normal roof, but the shingles would all be photovoltaics. Very exciting, something people had thought about for a while, and I thought, you know, if anybody has the money to do this, it's going to be Dow Chemical. They have a huge, huge research budget. So I decided to go there. And I was married at the time. My husband also got a job there, so we went to Midland, Michigan. And I learned a lot there. I also learned that science is just as much psychology as anything else. And you have to figure out how to run a meeting when you're a person in a meeting that has absolutely no power. You have to figure out how to get people to do the right thing who don't want to listen to scientists. You have to deal with marketers. You have to deal with a lot of people that don't have scientific backgrounds who want to do the right thing. But as you get farther and farther away from science and from content, charisma starts to take over. So if you're in a big room and there's a bunch of super charismatic people saying, oh no, we should do this thing, that aren't based on data, that isn't based on content, and then you're there saying, well, my experiments show this, you might not be listened to, and you have to figure out how to solve that problem. So being good at science is like the first thing you need to do. And then there's all this other social engineering that comes after it, especially if you want to do science in industry. And so probably the number one thing I learned is how to read people, how to change my behavior so that people would listen to me. I read a lot of books about this. I learned about personality types. All this stuff actually really helps. And so if you can get a leg up on that before you learn the hard way, it'd be a very good thing for you. I then moved to Dow Corning, which was a separate company at the time. And I went into silicones and batteries and did all this new business development stuff. And then I went to ARPA-E. So these are the different types of subject matter that I learned at this time. Everything from particle physics all the way to something called new business development, which is, can a company make something and make money at it? And you know, it's a long way from thinking about a wire chamber and what that means and looking at, you know, ionizing particles and when you get a signal on a wire and if that's going to tell you whether or not there's, you know, charge parity violation in the universe, to like figuring out if Samsung wants to buy your silicones for a phone. And some might think this. So, I mean, I felt like I was going to the dark side when I just went to material science. And that was nothing compared to what I did after that. But in reality, I think it's just where you are comfortable on this graph. Are you more applied or are you more fundamental in terms of what you enjoy doing? There's nothing wrong with any of this, okay? If you want a solution to make an impact, a company has to be able to make it and make money doing it. And if it can't do that, then your science is not going to have an impact. And it doesn't matter what it is. So you have to think about things like how much something can cost. And that can be really frustrating because you might be just trying to get a technology to work and just say, oh my gosh, you know, I'm trying to get these electrons to go over there and oh my gosh, I made it work. Oh my gosh, I made a solar cell that has 40% efficiency. That's great. But what does it actually mean for people to be able to make and buy it? And when you actually start looking at things like techno-economic models and how companies decide whether or not something will be profitable, it's staggering how difficult it is to make money doing anything. And people are very expensive. And it's very eye-opening to me to learn how difficult that was. And that's a message, and one of the reasons why I really wanted to come here and talk with you all is so that people can really appreciate that that is the reality of life. And if you want your technology to make a difference in the world, you have to consider how it's going to be used. And again, maybe you're doing basic fundamental science and you don't have to worry about that yet. That's fine. And your job in grad school is to learn and to learn how to learn. That's also your job in undergrad. I keep forgetting that you guys are in high school. You look so old to me. You guys are all very mature. But that's your job. Your job is to learn and to figure out what you're good at, okay? And figure out what you want to do. There's a lot of ways you can make an impact doing all sorts of different things. But at the end of the day, you always have to think about how you're going to solve a problem and how that solution is going to work in the real world. And that is something that it's been a long and difficult road for me to learn that. And it's been really disappointing sometimes to realize something I worked really hard on wasn't going to make a difference at all. And so the more you can be aware of that before you start, the better. And you can ask these questions to try to learn from it. All right, so let's move to technology now. So this is the most Australian picture I could find on my limited data connection. I've never eaten these. I have no idea, but you all just groaned, so I have an idea of what these taste like. But I pose to you this. These chips, no matter, or crisps, I don't know what you call them, they are crispy. They're crispy when you eat them, even if they're gross. And they're crispy because the inside of that bag has a metal film on it. If that bag was just a polymer bag, those things would be utterly mushy and disgusting. But metal is a very, very good moisture barrier. So you need a very thin film of a metal on the inside of that plastic bag for these chips to be even somewhat edible. That is the same process that we use to make computer chips or photovoltaics. It's thin film deposition. So how will potato chip bags save the world? Well, potato chip bags have metal thin films on them that cost practically nothing to put on. So let's take some lessons from potato chip bags and figure out how we can use that to try to do things like make solar cells better, or how to make computer chips. So this vapor phase deposition, all it means is that there's something in a gaseous form of vapor and it ends up making a solid film on something else. You can do this basically in a garbage can, which is basically what this is. So a thermal evaporation system, I don't know if any of you have ever seen one of these, but if you had a clean garbage can, you could sort of do this. You put basically a heater in there and some metal on the heater, and you have a substrate, and you pump all the air out of it, and you heat that stuff up, metal vapor goes up and hits the substrate, and it deposits a film. And people do this all the time. That's an example of what an evaporation boat looks like. You're putting quite a bit of current through there. It gets really, really hot, but it's very basic technology. And so think about even the most basic technology, and this is another thing that they don't really teach you in grad school too much, is you need to think about all the things that can change when you're doing an experiment. So you have control over the material of substrate. Maybe you're depositing on a metal, maybe you're depositing on plastic, you don't want it to melt. The material of what you want to evaporate, make a gold film. I wish, if I still had a lab, I would have bought gold pennies for everybody, but I don't have a lab anymore, so I'm sorry that you don't have any gold pennies. The temperature of that source, if you heat it up too hot, too fast, you might get some splattering, and that's not a good thing. Temperature of the substrate, are you going to heat that substrate up or not? Pressure, how good your vacuum is, these are all things you can control. And by the way, these films aren't necessarily great films. Wherever these atoms go, they just end up sticking right on the substrate. They don't move around or anything like that. So you're not going to make a great electronic quality film, but that's fine. But there's other variables. Did the last person who used it sneeze in it and not clean it? That would be bad. How recently was it cleaned? Has it ever been cleaned? Should it be cleaned? Et cetera, et cetera. One of the things about doing thin film vapor deposition is that you end up working with these really big stainless steel machines. You have these flanges that have 20 bolts on them, and you are always taking these things on and off and trying to figure out why isn't the vacuum good or why do my films have crap in them. It is very frustrating, but it's also interesting to try to do that troubleshooting and figure it out. But a lot of times we don't think about those different variables. And sometimes when you start to record these variables, you can learn that, oh, you know, I didn't get the right results. I was trying to do microscopy and it didn't go very well at 4 p.m. And oh, wait a minute, the train goes under the university at 4 p.m. every day or something like that. So a lot of times there's these hidden variables. And really try to think about that. That's something I learned from working at Dow, you know, at a company that makes a lot of money by having very strict processes and making lots of stuff the same all the time. And so, you know, when Jim comes over and runs the machine, it doesn't work right the next time or something like that. So try to think about all these variables when you're doing stuff in the lab. Just getting something to work once is useless. You have to get it to work over and over again and actually understand while it's working. So there's limitations here, and the limitations are that you're just heating this stuff up. It's just thermal energies of these atoms that are going up and hitting the substrate, which are around 1 eV or less. So the structure of the film's not going to be great. Types of materials are very limited. You can't make super fancy 4-component types of materials where everything's controlled. You're just sort of boiling some metal and the vapor's hitting the substrate. But this is just the start, and there's this huge, huge field of vapor deposition out there. And there's amazing machines and amazing science that goes into it, mostly driven by semiconductors and computers. There's a reason why, I should bring it out, but I have a USB stick now that's 128 gigs, and it's smaller than my fingernail, and it costs 40 bucks. Like, what is that? It's amazing how far that's come, and that's because of highly controlled vapor deposition and etching, making these very, very tiny little memory structures. So when we think about, okay, well, if we want to make this stuff good, we need to do more than just thermal deposition. We need to actually do some chemistry. We need to actually give this stuff energy, use kinetics. I mean, thermodynamics is the state that things want to be in. I would love to have a beautiful crystalline silicon film to make a really great photovoltaic cell. Kinetics is how it gets there. But if I'm not giving these things any energy, I'm just going to deposit garbage silicon, and it's not going to work at all. How can I give this stuff energy but not melt my substrate? How can I make a beautiful crystalline semiconductor film that has exactly the right dopants in it and everything else? We need to do something other than heat stuff up. So what can we do? Again, I basically just said all this stuff. We want to use chemistry and energy to make other structures. Thermally, these things are really lazy. So this is the most important thing. This is what we can do. This is a clue. This is a cat video, so this just used a lot of energy because I had to download this from the internet and somebody had to tape it. This is a plasma ball, and I can't believe the cat's licking it because it's probably getting little shocks right now. Plasmas are great. And look, I even found a dog licking a plasma ball, so that was very exciting. Plasmas give us a level of control that we can't get any other way. It's a fourth state of matter. It's basically ions with free electrons that can move around, It's a very, very good charge conductor as opposed to a gas. And plasmas are basically why we have good thin film deposition. So here's a video of somebody who's putting 5 kilovolts DC between these 2 electrodes. And here's a tube, and he's pumping it down. And you can see that the pressure is going down. So what starts to happen? You start to see something called the glow discharge. And what's happening here, so this is the cathode, this is the anode. So you have ions actually hitting this cathode, and they actually liberate electrons when they do that. There's some somewhat complex stuff that happens in here. This glow you see here is actually because you have electrons changing their acceleration. Then you had a space where you didn't see anything at all, and that's because electrons didn't have enough energy to actually excite any of the gas, so you didn't see anything. But then in this area here, you saw this very strong glow. And that glow, and it was probably argon from the color of it, that's what you see when you see a neon sign or something like that. That glow is actually really important, and we can measure it, and we can actually learn what's going on in the chemistry of the gas by actually looking at that glow. So there's a lot of fun stuff that we can do. But that's like a super simple plasma. These things get really complex. You can use RF instead of DC and do all sorts of things. But the key is that the particles in that plasma had more energy than thermal particles. And we can use that energy to do good things. So here's sort of an example of what I was talking about, and that there's some sort of different spaces in here depending on what the electrons are doing, the ions are doing, and the amount of energy that they have. So here's a growth chamber depositing something with a plasma. So it can give these atoms or molecules that are coming down to the surface much more energy so they can move around. So now they can make a nice crystal instead of just sticking wherever they end up and not having any surface mobility. That's one of the things that a term that we use, higher surface mobility, is a good thing. We can also make species that we wouldn't have been able to make before. You might be able to add hydrogen. Hydrogen can do interesting things. I mean, there's just so many different things we can do. And you can also use these ions from the plasma themselves to bombard the surface. So the argon won't react with the film necessarily, but it will restructure the film. And that's something that's actually really exciting. So there's a technique that is slightly better than the one I just showed you, which is called sputtering. And actually, if we go back to that glow discharge for a second, remember I said that basically these, the ions are accelerated towards the cathode and electrons come out, but also some of the cathode actually literally gets broken off and will sort of end up depositing on the glass. And that's called sputtering. Sputtering is actually a really useful growth technique. So you can actually put a disk of material, right here on your cathode, put a strong magnet behind it so you can get these sort of loops and you can get a much stronger plasma near the target, and you can actually deposit extremely good films doing this. So this is something that's actually used in industry. I think I had did I have a picture of, here's an example of a really big sputter target from a company called Von Ardena. And I mean, very large pieces of glass, when you see low-E coatings and stuff like that, it's always done by sputtering. So this is actually very mature industry, but it doesn't mean that you can't still do really cool things with it. So let's go back and think about solar a little bit more. So if we want to deposit silicon films, how can we make silicon films better? By using a plasma and using the sputtering technique. So here's an example of, so this is some stuff that I did in grad school. So think about having a chunk of silicon, you have a plasma, and you have a substrate. We have a lot more parameters now than just the temperature of things. And again, the energy of these particles is much higher than thermal. Thermal is about 1 eV. If this is too high, you're going to start to damage your film. You're going to start to move atoms out of their crystalline spaces and have something called a vacancy, and that's going to give you defects, and that won't work well. So you have to tune it exactly right in terms of what the energies of these particles need to be that are hitting your film, either the silicon that's actually making the film or something like argon that's going to restructure the film. So we can play around with this, actually. And what we did is put magnets on the outside of the chamber to actually sort of move the glow area of the plasma around. What that was really doing was changing the amount of argon ions hitting the film. Not their energy. Their energy stayed the same, but the flux changed. And by doing that, you can get more energy to the surface without breaking things. So that's an example of something. So here's sort of a cartoon showing that. You could also use hydrogen. It basically heals a lot of the defects in silicon. And there was something very interesting that people saw at this time, which is when they used deuterium instead of hydrogen, and I think you know what deuterium is, the solar cells worked better. Why would the solar cells work better if you put deuterium in there? People were really thinking hard about this and thinking, oh, there's got to be some phonon vibration, density of states change, and it has to be something really difficult. So we decided to figure that out. Why did we want to figure it out? It's because solar is expensive. And back in the 90s, it was thought that, well, wafers will always be too expensive for anybody to actually use for solar, so we need to do thin film solar. How do we do thin film solar? You have to have very, very high quality material, and that's very difficult. So when you have a silicon wafer, it's pulled from a boule. The entire boule is one single crystal. You saw them apart, you polish them, and you have this beautiful material. So it has to be very high quality because it's thick, because the charge carriers actually diffuse around instead of being field-driven. You've probably had a solar talk or 2 or 3 already, so I'm not going to go into that much. But to be able to have a thin film, and it uses far less material, that film has to be really good. And it can't be single crystal anymore because you don't have a single crystal substrate. So how can we make thin films much higher quality? This is something people still work on. Okay? So this has been around for a long time. So we decided, well, let's use some of these things we just talked about in terms of bombarding the surface of the growing films with these higher energy ions and see if we can't figure out how to make it better. And so this is an example of you can grow crystalline material at pretty low temperatures if you add a bunch of hydrogen or deuterium. And it's because you make things on the surface move around more readily. We actually proved that with some of the work that we did. So what do you actually see? There's a bunch of this neutral hydrogen that actually reflects off the target that actually goes and can impinge pretty deep into the film of this material. So when you change it to deuterium, we measured this, the flux of the energy doesn't really change. But you have a lot more momentum transfer because the deuterium is much heavier. If you have more momentum transfer, you're going to restructure the film more. So what we showed is that these films, and there's a lot of different ways to do it, were more crystalline. Even though they're still mostly amorphous and they have some crystalline parts in them, whenever you use deuterium, the films end up being more crystalline. For example, here's something called Raman scattering. Here's an amorphous peak and a crystalline peak, and the peak's higher for deuterium. So we measured this over and over again and proved that the films are far more crystalline when you use deuterium. And it turns out that it's exactly what you want to do. I'll skip some of this. Is you actually want to grow films that are right in this range where they're almost completely crystalline, but they're not quite yet. And if you use deuterium, you just got there easier. So if you just use more hydrogen, it's the same effect. And so people started calling that protocrystalline silicon, and it's something that started to be used quite a bit. So that was a lot of fun because we actually showed what the mechanism was for something that was confusing people as to why it was working. So that was really exciting. But did it matter? So here's the hard question. It sort of didn't matter. And this is something that is still, I think, a topic of conversation with a lot of people. But especially now, and this wasn't true then, and we can't always read the future, but the cost of a solar installation is not driven by the cost of the silicon in the cells. It's really not. And depending on the country that you're in, I mean, this 70 cents per watt, this is the module, the entire module. That's the PV and everything else. And all of this garbage is everything else. It's red tape, it's installation, it's everything else. And everything else swamps the cost of actually just the solar. So it turns out that the only thing that really matters, I mean within some boundaries, is the efficiency of the cell. So making lower efficiency solar using far less material actually leaves you much worse off. And there were a lot of companies that were doing thin film silicon, really good companies. They got efficiencies that were so, like nobody thought they could be that good. I mean, people did amazing work, and all of these companies are gone. They're all gone. And that was really sad. Now, there are some materials that people are working on to try to get thin film efficiencies much, much higher. So it's not that thin film research is gone or anything like that. But looking at especially things like amorphous and microcrystalline silicon, that was very, very difficult. And I personally was involved with some of these companies and watched them go away. And it was very hard because a lot of people did a lot of great work. And in the end, that work didn't really matter. Because if you had looked at the solution from the back end and said, well, okay, how much does this system need to cost as it's deployed in the real world? You would have seen that the sensitivity to that solar cost wasn't really what people thought it was. So I, went to Dow Chemical, and I worked in the solar business where we were going to make these shingles out of SIGs, which is a much higher efficiency material than silicon, but still thin film, still not single crystal, and worked my butt off, worked too hard. And a lot of people worked very hard. A lot of money was spent, and that business has now gone under. And if Dow Chemical couldn't get that to work, and Dow Chemical knows building materials, and they know how much this needed to cost, and that was a very difficult technical thing to try to make happen. But the decision to go thin film was not the right decision. And our hands were really tied. I was actually surprised how firmly the decisions were made before we even got there. So it's very important to keep these things in mind when you're trying to figure out what to work on, because there's so many different things you're going to be able to work on. And I don't regret any of the time I spent because I learned so much doing so many different things. But gosh, it would have been nice for those shingles to actually have succeeded and to be on the market. I'd like to see more solar in the world. So how can I get there to be more solar in the world? This is not the way for me to do it. There might be other things I can do. And as I continued working in these different companies and learning more and more, I realized that I really needed to be somewhat in charge of decision making and where the money went. And I was so many layers away from that when I was at these companies. And sometimes it will drive you crazy because you'll be like, why are they making that decision? There might be a good reason, but they're not sharing it with you. Well, how are you supposed to learn if you don't know what that decision-making process is? And then I would go up a level and go up a level and be like, wait, do I have to actually be the CTO to be able to influence a decision around here? I mean, this is crazy. This is really challenging. And that's why I went to ARPA-E, because I wanted to be able to make an impact. And at ARPA-E, I put together a program. I decide who I want to recommend for funding, and I actively manage that funding with people. So I am able to sort of make those decisions and get things funded that I want to be funded. But it is pretty impressive how difficult that is to do in the private sector. But every company's different. Some companies are actually much better at this than some other companies. Some reason I went to Dow Corning is because they had a business and technology incubator that was sort of supposed to be like a startup. Like it had its own budget, it had, it sort of had some autonomy, and it was supposed to be able to do sort of more high-risk, crazy stuff. And that's why I went there. That shut down 2 years after I went there. It's very, very hard for large companies to do research like this. And I'm not saying the research they do is bad, but if you want to do stuff that's different or more on the cutting edge, you really have to think about the culture of the company that you're going to. And that's one of the reasons why, especially in the US, has a really good startup culture. And a lot of people work at startups, which is a hard life, but you learn a lot really fast, and you can do some things much more easily because you don't need 10 people's permission to do an experiment. So keep these things in mind. Now let's do a time check. Where are we? Okay, not too bad. All right, I'm going to talk about one other thing, since we're talking about thin films anyway, and that's diamond thin films. So when I went to Argonne National Lab, I knew I wanted to work in thin films, but I wanted to do something totally different. And there was a group there that had a way of making diamond in a really different way. So if you have a diamond, by the way, this is one of my favorite slides, because that Wired cover came out the same time that picture came out of me in the newspaper, so it's a little compare and contrast situation. Diamond gets a lot of press, which makes it a very interesting field to work in. And you very quickly learn that most press isn't entirely on the level. I mean, sometimes it is, but there's always this desire for people to get press to help get funding, and a lot of times claims are emphasized maybe a little bit too much. And with diamond, it's really interesting because you'll go give a talk at the Materials Research Society. Totally academic talk, technical. There's two guys from De Beers standing in the back of the room like this, staring at you. Every time I gave a diamond talk, they were the De Beers guys. So we would joke about it. I mean, they looked like they were from the FBI or something. It was whatever. It was pretty funny. But there was a lot of competition in this field. There's still competition in this field. And so that was interesting to try to figure out how to navigate that. But there's a lot of people doing a lot of really good work. But what does it really mean for diamond to be a useful material? I mean, diamonds themselves, they're not all that rare. If you have a chunk of diamond, how is that really useful for electronics or something like that? It's not really useful. For something to be useful for something like electronics, you have to be able to make films and etch it and pattern it and do all sorts of interesting things and dope it so that it conducts electrons or holes. So diamond has some challenges in that area. But if we can make thin films of diamond, we can try to figure out how to get around some of those challenges. Now, making a single crystal of diamond is really hard because you have to grow it on top of a single crystal of diamond. Super slow, insanely expensive. I actually have some lab-grown diamonds. They're very beautiful, but that's not what we're trying to do. So we're actually making very tiny little crystals of diamond, nanometers, in a thin film that have a bunch of grain boundaries. And we're doing it by chemical vapor deposition. So it's just methane and hydrogen. It's a microwave plasma generator. And it makes these interesting species, which end up being C2, which is unusual for diamond growth, to make these types of films. And I think I have a picture. Here we are. So normally people would try to grow very large grains of diamond and try to make it like single crystal diamond to try to get these properties of diamond. But you still have all these grain boundaries in here. And so it's going to impact how the film acts, especially things like breakdown voltage and stuff like that. But if you make tiny, tiny little grains, you end up getting a very, very smooth film. This is actually really interesting that you can have a film that's this smooth. And this is 1 nanometer, okay? So these grains are like 4 to 5 nanometers across. And as a little tidbit of information, somebody who is doing work on the theoretical side of this is Dr. Amanda Bernard. And she is director of an institute in Melbourne that does work in this area. And she came and spoke at ISS 2 years ago. I had no idea she had done that. And I told her out of the blue, oh, I'm coming to Australia to talk for this thing. And she's like, really? I did that 2 years ago. And I'm like, what? So small world. But anyway, but this is a very interesting material because you can actually dope it N-type with nitrogen, and you don't get these super deep states. It means that you can actually get it to work reasonably well, which diamond isn't supposed to do. And it has some really interesting properties. It has very interesting field emission properties, and it has very, very low friction. And very low, something we call stiction, which is when you first move something on a surface. And you don't get that unless you have a very smooth film. So people had been looking at something called diamond-like carbon, which is amorphous diamond, and it's sp3 bonded carbon, but the lattice is all amorphous. You can make that pretty easily, and people were looking at that for low friction coatings and things. It was actually on the, those of you who know your razors, there's, I don't know if it's called that here, but it's called the Mach 3. We have it in the US, and that razor has a diamond-like coating on it, and those blades last for months and months. I actually, when I was once Googling them, I found in an internal company presentation that was talking about trying to use a different film because people weren't buying enough blades because they were so good. So anyway, there's a little plug for their blades, and it's because of this diamond-like carbon coating. So how can we make this stuff actual diamond, not amorphous diamond, and how can we make it into useful electronics? So when you dope this stuff with nitrogen when you're growing it, something very interesting happens. If we skip some of this stuff, it becomes extraordinarily conductive, like many, many, many orders of magnitude more conductive than it ever should be. And this is a really big mystery about why this was happening. It's also a very useful property. And you know, the mobilities aren't super high, so this is not something you're going to use to make, say, a computer chip or something like that. But they're high enough to be very useful in terms of electronic coatings and things like that. And it probably happened because you have these grain boundaries when you grow with nitrogen. So without nitrogen, you almost can't measure these things. And I took these pictures. It's sort of hard to get these pictures at the time, so I'm very proud of them. But again, this is 2 nanometers. You can't even really see where the grain boundaries are. When you grow with nitrogen, you actually get these slightly wider grain boundaries. And what you have happening here is that electric conduction is going through the grain boundaries and not the grains themselves. But the bulk of the film is still made up of these little single crystals of diamond, so you still have a lot of diamond characteristics in the film. So it ends up being very useful. So did any of this matter? Well, I think the people that are starting to get retinal implants so that they can see again care. And one of the reasons why that's possible is because these things are coated with these diamond films. If you try to put silicon chips in somebody's eye, they last like 2 weeks. The body is actually an extremely corrosive and difficult place for semiconductors to live. You need a material that's extremely bioinert to be able to do this. And you need materials that are also electrically conductive. So these types of diamond films are actually extremely useful for bioimplants. And there's multiple spin-off companies now, started by people that I worked with at Argonne, looking at using diamond films for things like tooth implants, joint implants, arterial stents, things like that. So it turned out that the fact that these are so biocompatible is actually one of the most interesting things about these films. But for some uses, they need to be conductive in order to be useful. So that's really exciting. These things, they need to be very conformal films. There's tricks about how to grow them to be able to have them, cover something that's going to go into the body. It's also a difficult area of research because waiting for FDA approval takes a very long time. So Professor Acello, who I know very well, he's at UT Dallas. He actually started a company in Mexico and maybe one in Argentina in order to help the research move more quickly because the FDA is so slow. So that's one thing you can do. There was a startup that came out of the group at Argonne called Advanced Diamond Technologies, and they can use these films for things like water treatment, chemical pump seals, and bearings for pharma, because they're so inert and because they're so low friction. Well, it turns out that that's like one of the most useful things about this material. So if you look at, for example, a passenger car, 33% of that energy goes to losses from friction. If you look at machinery and mining, 47% of the energy is lost in friction. So I have seen this quoted in a few different places that anywhere between 5 to 20% of the energy in the world is lost to friction. So if we can reduce friction, we can save energy. And it might not be super obvious how we're going to do that, but materials like this are really, really helping. So no, you didn't see a bunch of diamond electronics come out of that work, but that work is helping with stuff like this. So sometimes it's properties of materials that you didn't necessarily expect that are end up going to be the most useful. So the point is that if you do good work and you have an open mind and you're flexible, something good's probably going to come out of that work. You just have to understand how it's going to be used at the end of the day. And this whole structure-property relationship of materials, that you can change a structure of a film and get completely new properties out of it, to me that's super exciting. And that's one of the reasons I went into the field I went into. And that's part of what materials is all about. So in terms of conclusions from some of this stuff, I would say, challenge yourself in what you're doing and think about what the system would look like that your research is going to go into, even if it's very, very fundamental basic research. Why are you doing it? What are you trying to learn? And what are you hoping that it's going to change? Be flexible. So this means not just in your own research, but maybe where you work, what institution you're at, what major you have. Give yourself that freedom and flexibility to change things if they're not feeling right for you. And also, every time you put yourself in a new and uncomfortable situation, it's really good for you. And you will learn stuff that you never would have imagined. There's nothing more terrifying than the first day of a new job when you don't know where the building is, nobody else is new, and you're just like, okay, I'm the new idiot here and I don't know anything. You need to do that a lot. It is really good for you to do that because you eventually lose your fear of those kinds of situations. You also should be giving a lot of talks. If it makes you feel nervous, do it. That's really important. I used to not communicate at all. I couldn't have given this talk in a million years. I couldn't give any talk. I was super, super shy. I used to cross out all the right answers on tests and change them to the wrong answers at the last minute. That was the kind of person I was. And it took me putting myself through all of these different changes and these difficult experiences to learn how to interact with people and how to make an impact, whether it's at companies or at the job I'm at now. But above all, and I think you've had a talk on ethics here, you need to do good work. And that means you need to do ethical work, you need to do repeatable work, you need to be honest about what you know and honest about what you don't know. If you do good work, that will follow you throughout your career. And even if what you're working on at one moment doesn't end up panning out the way you want, there will be people that know that you did good work and that will follow you. And people that don't do good work, eventually people figure that out. So no matter what you're working on, there's no excuse for doing a bad job. There's no excuse for doing bad science, especially in today's world. And then, be proactive. Network with people, talk to people. Science is all people. These are all people making decisions. And sometimes people don't know the right kind of people to talk to make the right decision. So the more people you learn about and network with and talk with, for example, the people that are sitting around you right here, what are you going to be doing in 10 years? Where are you going to be working? Are you going to call up your friend from the ISS and say, hey, I just got this grant. I heard that you're doing some really interesting work on blockchain technology. Maybe we should do a project together. That's literally how this stuff happens. So keep in touch with the people that you know. Be proactive about meeting people that you don't know. I think that's my last slide. Bring questions tomorrow. I will answer anything I can if it is legal to do so. Tomorrow I'm going to talk a lot more about specifically ARPA-E and how the agency works, how we decide what problems to work on, and a program that I put together and started myself there. And we'll have quite a bit of time for questions tomorrow, I hope. So if you want to just come and ask them, if you want to drop off a paper on the desk, if you want to email me, I don't care how it gets to me. But think about those questions and ask me, because I will be honest with you, and I will tell you if I can't answer something. And sometimes it's hard to get those blunt answers, so use the time wisely. Okay, thank you very much.